We've examined the anthropic principle characteristics that are necessary for life. In other words, those characteristics of the universe and its components that seem to have to be there for life to exist. Now we're going to look at the anthropic principle characteristics not necessary for life. Things that are anthropic principle characteristics. It looks like the universe was created for humans, but things that aren't necessary for human existence. They're for other reasons. For example, we've got anthropic principle characteristics that make it possible for us to understand the universe. Not to live, not to exist, but just to be able to understand the universe. For example, we've got this interesting characteristic of human language, that human language corresponds to the universe. That in fact we can describe the universe with language, that we can use the language of mathematics to describe the universe, that the universe comes very close to fitting that perfect human language of mathematics. That's pretty cool. That makes it possible to understand the universe, but it's also a very strange characteristic of both language and the universe that it should happen to correspond. The two should be able to be that compatible, that close to each other. It's a strange universe indeed that happens to correspond to human language. Also, the fact that the laws of the universe, we've already discussed this in a previous lesson, that the laws of the universe, the regularities of the universe, are actually discoverable by humans, understandable by humans by the language, but also can be discovered in a single human lifetime. Why should it be that something as huge and as long-lasting as the universe should be understandable within a human lifetime? It's very handy. It's not something that's necessary for our survival, but it sure is cool that that happens because it allows us to be able to understand the universe. Also, we're sitting in the galaxy, not in the center. We've already talked about reasons why being in the center is a bad place to live for our existence. But there's another nice thing about being 2/3 of the way out from the center of the galaxy, and that is, as I've already referred, we can actually see outside the galaxy. If we were in the middle, if we were around any one of 90% of the stars in our galaxy, we would not be able to see out of the center of the galaxy. We would only see other stars. There would be so many of them that we couldn't see anything else. We wouldn't even know that our galaxy was spiral-shaped. All we'd think is there's a bundle of stars close by. That's it. We certainly wouldn't know that there were other galaxies. We wouldn't have these beautiful Hubble telescope pictures of galaxies and nebulae and so on and so forth that we see. We would know much, much, much less about the universe if we were sitting in a normal or the usual position in the galaxy. It is really nice. It's nice that we're sitting in this particular position, that we can know things. There's also anthropic principle characteristics that are good for culture development. Again, not for our existence per se, but that we can develop the kind of culture we have developed. For example, we have this extraordinary atmosphere that not only provides the heat, the temperature we need to exist, it not only protects us from harmful radiation, but it allows us to communicate, put it that way. If you look at the entire spectrum of radiation that is possible, radiation from the sun, radiation from any source, and then you compare all of those possible wavelengths of radiation with the wavelengths that would harm us. You got sections of that range of wavelengths. Certainly wavelengths that are very high energy, they're all dangerous to us. Wavelengths of very low energy for various reasons are dangerous to us. You'll find that the atmosphere does a really good job of blocking out all the bad radiation. But that still leaves a significant amount of, a significant number of wavelengths available that the atmosphere doesn't block. In fact, if you look at the correspondence, you realize the atmosphere really only blocks the harmful radiation. It leaves all sorts of wavelengths that aren't blocked that we can use for the purpose of communication, transmitting information. For example, I'm transmitting, I don't understand these things, but I'm transmitting wavelengths from sound to the camera here to you, and we're utilizing certain wavelengths that can travel through this atmosphere freely. Television waves, radio waves, visual, the sight colors, red, blue, green, yellow, those can run through our atmosphere freely, allowing us to see, allowing us to communicate, allowing us to transmit information. It's really cool that our atmosphere, it could potentially block all of that, but it doesn't. It allows, in fact, us to develop culture along the way that it has done so. There's just some really cool things. There's a number of others that we won't go into, but there's a number of characteristics of the universe that turn out not to be essential for our existence, but in fact are really nice for the development of human culture. What about the origin of these anthropic principal characteristics? First of all, if one is a naturalist, if you believe in naturalism, what do you do with these things? Well, in a naturalistic worldview, there's no creator to have designed the universe in such a way that it was designed for humans. So although the universe looks like it was designed for humans, the naturalist would say, no, it's not designed for humans. It might look that way, but it is not designed for humans. They would say the characteristics of the universe were just happened to be. The universe could have been billions of other ways. It could have been created with very different, or formed. It could have spontaneously formed with any number of other characteristics, but this universe just happened to have the characteristics that it does. Now, that makes it sound like this universe would be an extremely improbable universe, and indeed, that would seem to be the case. But usually the naturalist would respond to say, now, wait a minute, you got to think about this a little bit. Then now we're going to talk about the anthropic principal characteristics necessary for life. If the universe had been any other way, we wouldn't be here to observe it. So of course the universe has characteristics necessary for life, because if it had any characteristics that make life impossible, we wouldn't be here to see it. So the naturalists very commonly will say, well, duh, of course the universe has characteristics that make life possible, because we can see it. If life wasn't possible, we wouldn't be here to see it. Now that sounds like, on the face of it, well, okay, that's kind of reasonable. I guess we might expect that. It still is an issue that so many characteristics of the universe are necessary for life, and in a naturalistic worldview, any sort of universe could have come to be. That makes this universe an extremely improbable one. If you had thousands and thousands and thousands of universes, if you had 1 million universes, the chances are, because there are so many characteristics that have to be just right for life, that not a single one of them would have been capable of sustaining life, or creating, or forming life, or life forming spontaneously. So it still seems like naturalism is calling for a highly improbable, basically impossible universe. But beyond that, there's also the fact that the naturalist has no way of explaining the anthropic principal characteristics unnecessary for life. Sure, those necessary for life have to be there for life to be here, for us to observe it, but the universe didn't have to have characteristics that make it possible for us to study the universe. We didn't have to have an atmosphere that had sufficient clarity to allow electromagnetic waves to run through it of all sorts of wavelengths. We didn't have to have an atmosphere that we could communicate through, that we could see that much through. We didn't have to have a universe that happens to have a structure corresponding to human language. We didn't have to have a universe with natural laws that are understandable in a single human lifetime. These are things unnecessary, and so each one of those actually does make the universe less and less probable in a naturalistic worldview. We turn out to be in an improbable enough universe for life to exist, an even more improbable universe for life to be able, for humans to be able to understand the universe. It's much more reasonable to believe that the universe really was created for humans. It looks as if the universe was designed with humans in mind, not just for humans to live, but for humans to understand the universe, for humans to comprehend the nature of the universe, for humans to develop culture. It's much more reasonable to assume that a God desiring humans to understand Him created the universe simple enough for us to understand Him and put illustrations of His nature into the creation in such a way that we not only can exist, but we can understand the universe and thus understand God. A creationist perspective of the world explains the anthropic principal characteristics quite readily, whereas the naturalistic perspective struggles with it. So what are we to do with this information? First of all, our responsibility as priests of the creation is to know God. As we study the anthropic principal characteristics of the universe and its components, we come to learn something or given an interesting perspective on God's love. Way back at the creation thousands of years ago, long before you or I ever came to be, God anticipated our needs. He anticipated our needs to survive, and He anticipated the culture we would have developed and would need to develop. He anticipated the understanding of the universe that He wanted us to have, and He provided those needs, those things that we need, thousands of years ago. That provision, thinking ahead for what we would need ahead of time, is an illustration of God's love for us. So we get a perspective on God's love by studying the anthropic principal characteristics. We also get an amazing perspective of God in His creative activity. That He isn't just poofing the universe into being. He's thinking ahead as to what the needs will be of those things that He's created thousands of years in the future. This act of creation becomes an amazingly well-designed system to provide for things ahead of time. We're given, as we study these anthropic principal characteristics, insight into what it means for God to be creator. And then His wisdom. To have figured all this stuff out, to figure out what was needed, when it was needed, where it was needed, exactly how to structure the universe so that it would work just right. The intelligence, the ingenuity, the wisdom of God is truly astonishing. But it isn't just the wisdom, it's because you could perhaps know how it ought to be made, but not have the ability to actually make it that way. God not only thought out everything that had to be, but He even put it into practice. He put it together. He had the sufficient power to actually arrange things, everything exactly the way it was supposed to be. So we're given insight not just into His wisdom, but into His unlimited power. And the fact, of course, that we can understand this, and the fact that part of the anthropic principal characteristics have to do with the fact that we can know the universe or understand the universe, is because this is a God who wants us to know Him. So a God of such love and such wisdom and such power that desires us to know Him, the more I learn about the anthropic principle, the more I'm in awe of this God that created us. And I can't help but, under these circumstances, fall into worship of the God that created these things. The more I learn about the anthropic principle characteristics, the more I'm awed by this God, the more I want to worship Him, and the more I want to bring others into that worship. And of course, as I do that, as I learn more about His creation, thus falling into greater worship of Him and bringing others into worship, I'm fulfilling my responsibility as a priest of the creation. What about our responsibility as kings of the creation? First of all, we should preserve the anthropic principle design of the universe. Now, in point of fact, most of these anthropic principle designs are not things we can do anything about. They're not things, fortunately, that we can mess up. We mess up a lot of things, but we can't mess up the three-dimensional nature of the universe. We can't mess up the nature, the relative mass of electrons and protons. We can't mess up the characteristics of water. So for most of the anthropic principle characteristics, fortunately, they're not things we can really bumble. But there are some things that we can affect and we can compromise. For example, in spite of the characteristics of water that are so great, part of the disadvantage of the design of water is that it's a really good solvent, not just of the good things, but of the bad things. So as we create bad things, as we pollute the water and compromise life on this planet, we aren't technically changing the characteristics of water, but we are in fact poisoning water in our planet. We need to avoid the pollution of water and of the atmosphere and of the land, those things that have been designed by God far into the past for the purpose of our survival and thriving. We also should consider the fact that we do not overuse water. Water is essential for life. We've seen a few of the reasons why that is in fact the case. We need water to survive, not just water to drink, but we need water for the organisms that in fact we eat. We need water for the environment. Water is essential for life, for all of life. And as we use water, let's say we're taking it out of a well, that water is not unlimited. It somewhere went into the ground and made its way through the ground and to the reservoir that you're pulling the water out of. For example, in eastern United States, much of the water comes from the St. Peter sandstone. There's a layer of rock that is a sandstone that has holes between the grains of sand that water flows through. Water enters the St. Peter sandstone in Canada and flows through that rock underneath most of the eastern United States and flows eventually all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. It takes about 1,000 years for the water to make its way along that path. All through that path, people have drilled these holes down into the ground and pulled up water from the St. Peter sandstone. As we draw water out of the St. Peter sandstone, there's someone else who isn't able to get water. If we draw too much water, there's people downstream, further to the south, that will not be able to get water. We see the same thing in the Colorado River. It goes through the Grand Canyon. Now it's heavily controlled with dams and that sort of thing, but I think it's somewhere around 20,000 cubic feet per second of water goes through the Grand Canyon. It's an awesome amount of water when you're there. But interestingly enough, as people take the water out of the Colorado River, by the time the river gets to the Pacific Ocean, there's no water left. In fact, the water is taken out of the Colorado River before it ever gets to Mexico. The U.S. pulls every bit of that water. 20,000 cubic feet of water per I mean, this is ridiculous. That much is being taken out. There are places where we've lowered the water table because of our wells. We've pulled the water out of rivers and lakes to such an extent that we've threatened the existence of life, human and otherwise. We should be careful not to overuse the water that is on our earth. We should also not destroy ozone. Ozone protects us from ultraviolet radiation. But we learned several years ago that there were some substances we were creating as humans on the planet that was in fact, or we thought it was compromising the existence of ozone. For example, CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, were used in hairsprays to cause the stuff in the can to be accelerated through the air and onto the hair. Those CFCs were in fact shown in the lab to break down ozone. Also, we use CFCs in air conditioning units. It's what we cooled the air down with. And as the CFCs would leak out of air conditioning units and refrigeration units, as it would be sprayed into the air for hairsprays, it was feared that this would actually interact with ozone and destroy it. As it destroyed ozone, we would be endangered by the ultraviolet radiation. It resulted in ultimately a ban on CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and we have found other ways to develop hairsprays and air conditioning units that do not destroy ozone. This is an excellent example of where we recognize, there's something we're doing that is destroying the design of the creation. We need to modify it. Likewise, we need to be careful about the production of carbon dioxide. As we burn trees, as we burn fossil fuels, we throw out as a waste product carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a good thing. It warms the earth. It's the food that's necessary for plants to produce food for animals. But if there's too much carbon dioxide, such as we have on Venus, it can warm up the earth too much. And those conditions are a concern. And so we need to, if we can, find ways to limit our production of carbon dioxide, certainly in cases where it's not necessary. For example, the cultures in the tropics very often, in order to plant crops, will cut down the forest and then burn the forest. The burning of the forest puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and use the ashes as fertilizer to plant crops. But because the soil is so bad in the tropics, that only works for a couple of years, and then there's not enough fertilizer to grow crops, and so they cut more forest. That cutting and destroying and burning of forest is putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and not putting it back into trees or into crops, and as a result, it's unnecessarily heating up the earth. These are things we need to seriously consider curbing in order to not have the earth get too warm. Besides the preservation of the anthropic principle designs, we need to find ways also to enhance the incredible design of the planet. There are other ways to, as we found with CFCs, there are other ways to do the things that we do that do not have negative side effects. Find alternate ways of getting energy than burning fossil fuels that do not have side effects that would be dangerous to life. It is our responsibility as kings that we carefully examine what we're doing to the earth to make sure that we are not compromising the incredible design that God put into this planet long ago for the purpose of us not only thriving, but in fact better knowing Him.